Jimmy Carter was still in the White House when I started graduate school at Vanderbilt University. I chose Vanderbilt because it was the most liberal school that I had access to in the South, and I thought of myself as being a liberal, although I was not fully prepared at the tender young age of 24 for just what it actually meant to be what no one called woke 40 years ago. At orientation, we entering students in 1980 were rigorously indoctrinated into gender-inclusive language. It was a brand new concept to most of us, and it was controversial on at least two fronts. We had grown up using the pronoun he to reference either a man or a woman in a non-specific sentence. It was correct grammar at the time to say something like, the next voter in line must present his ID, whether it was a woman or a man. Now we were being told that we must say it, the next voter in line must present his or her ID. It seemed to be unnecessarily cumbersome, and there was no small amount of grumbling about it, but the other issue was considerably more powerful. We were, after all, grad students in theology. We were ministry students, future biblical scholars and professors, and the Bible clearly referenced God as Father, and Jesus, who at least in our minds at the time could hardly have been wrong, called God Father. We, however, were no longer to call God Father, and if we did so in any assignment, the paper would be returned for correction, and if we refused to correct it, the paper would be given an F. And that struck me as being very arbitrary and very heavy-handed. Vanderbilt, as a liberal school, even in 1980, had long accepted women into seminary, as well as men, gay men, straight men, all races of students. We had believers, we had atheists, we had biblical literalists and Catholics and Unitarians. In fact, we were free to believe anything we wanted to believe. There was just this one thing. There could be no references made to the deity using male-centered language. So we had to invent pronouns rather than himself. We learned to write God's self. And we stumbled and fumbled around with how to relearn how to speak our native tongue until, honestly, a few years later, it would have been very jarring to hear someone reference God with male language. I know it probably still happens in some churches. I just don't go to those churches. The point of the divinity school faculty was that words do more than just communicate. Words can work backwards, in fact. Words create categories in our minds. Words don't just convey what we are thinking to other people. Words help to shape what we are thinking in our own minds. In 1980, women were allowed to go to seminary in most mainstream denominations. They could apply for ordination. But sadly, they almost never got hired. Or if they did get a church job, it was to be in charge of Sunday school program or children's ministry, or to be a woman's minister or chaplain. It was rare, very rare, just 45 years ago, for a congregation to accept a woman as their pastor. Of course, tradition formed most of that barrier, but at least a part of it does have to do with language. Religion has been expressed in male-dominant language, and religion has therefore been a bastion that made gender discrimination common. In fact, even when you pass laws that make gender discrimination illegal in the workplace, that doesn't apply to churches, not at all. Churches can legally discriminate, even now, all day long, because of the separation of church and state. So, with insight that was initially difficult for me to believe, changing the language eventually began to change the prejudices that made churches think that religious leadership always had to come from a man. When I started in ministry, only about 2% of American preachers were women. 30 years later, nearly 1/3 of preachers are women. I suspect that the current statistic would be a lot higher, maybe closer to 50%, especially if you factor out the Roman Catholic Church, which in most matters that require thoughtful reflection, I usually start by dismissing the Roman Catholic Church. We are often asked to take care about matters of language, especially as it pertains to race. We call people from Asian countries Asian, even though it was common a couple of generations ago to just as easily call them Oriental. Initially, there was no insult intended by calling someone who was from what we called the Orient, Oriental, but it came to imply an object more than it did a person. A tea set might be Oriental, a rug might be Oriental, but my Korean daughter, she is Asian, and you don't want to fight me over this. The N-word that no decent person would use now was not especially insulting when Mark Twain wrote his novels. The word colored was in common usage when I was a child, and it's still enshrined in the name of the NAACP, which, as we know, is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. There have been members clamoring for a name change for 50 years now, but the title has stuck, just as the word Negro is still a part of the United Negro College Fund, though it would be a rather insensitive person who would use that word in common language today. As blacks in America have continued to suffer from racial discrimination, people who are trying to advance the cause of civil rights are regularly trying to massage our terminology to affirm the full humanity of black citizens in this country. And I would say, albeit cautiously, that there has been considerable progress. This hasn't been a waste of our time or effort, even though it obviously still isn't time to pull out George W. Bush's Mission Accomplished banner. The trans community for the last decade has been asking us to adapt our use of pronouns to be more inclusive of those who do not want to be tied to either gender. Many registration forms now ask us to include with our name and address our preferred pronouns, he and him, or she and her, or they and them, using they and them as a singular pronoun. That's as awkward to me as avoiding calling God Father was in 1980, but I'm determined to get the hang of it because I want the violence and discrimination against trans people to stop. And I know from experience that changing the way we talk can help to change the way we think. The grammar change may seem to be trivial, but the desired outcome is crucial. What is common language can become the barbed wire fence of the status quo. When a concept gets rooted in acceptable language norms, then the idea itself can become increasingly difficult to uproot. Those of us who dream of a more just world, a friendlier, a more loving, a safer world, often find ourselves being gatekeepers on dangerous ideas that are trying to edge their way into normal ways of speaking and thinking. Look at how the anti-vax people during the pandemic managed to almost normalize an anti-science mentality so that people that made C's and D's in their high school biology class could assert that they knew more about virology than Dr. Fauci. In fact, the governor of my newly adopted state used Dr. Fauci's name in place of the more common F word, vowing that the government wouldn't get to Fauci, Florida. And thanks to Governor DeSantis's anti-science policies, Florida had one of the highest death rates from COVID-19 in the country, a fact that the anti-vax crowd likes to call fake news, because they seem to still think that mathematics is a matter of opinion. And now, independent presidential candidate Robert Kennedy Jr. is leaning towards an anti-vax running mate, and if he chooses New York Jets running back Aaron Rodgers, he gets both an anti-vaxxer and someone who claims that the Sandy Hook school shootings were a hoax. A conspiracy theory that you might have thought would have lost popularity after the talk show host Alex Jones was ordered to pay nearly $1 billion to victims' families by a Connecticut court. If Aaron Rodgers has any friends, I hope they can talk him off the ledge before he loses whatever he has left from his pro football earnings. Maybe I should be more worried about RFK and Aaron Rodgers, but they seem to be enough out on the fringe to be a minor concern. But what's been really chewing on me lately was the election that was reported on Super Tuesday. Not the Trump or Biden votes, which have been entirely predictable, but rather the election in North Carolina for a gubernatorial candidate. North Carolina voters will elect a new governor this fall, and the candidate who won the GOP battle on March 5th was their current lieutenant governor, Mark Robinson. 4 years ago, Robinson prevailed in a field of 8 candidates to become the first black lieutenant governor in the state's history. And now he's poised to be the state's first black governor. But Robinson's nomination is no cause for celebration. This is not an instance of progress in racial diversity. Robinson is a fascist. Robinson is a fascist who claims that the Nazis were not that bad, that the accounts of the Holocaust are just hogwash, and he is radically opposed to gay and lesbian rights, as well as abortion rights. And well, this is a frightening man whom Donald Trump has recently described as being Martin Luther King on steroids. Of course, Donald Trump is, and I must beg your forgiveness for using technical psychological terminology here, but Trump is just a racist moron who can't see past the fact that Robinson is black, and that is all that he would know about Martin Luther King. Now, I've spoken in churches in North Carolina in the past. I have vacationed in North Carolina. I believe some of the most beautiful places on earth are in North Carolina. But folks, North Carolina has become fertile soil for some of the most dangerously crazy ideas in America. And we must not let these ideas become normal. This is not normal. Robinson won the GOP nomination by a margin of 43 points, a landslide. Even though he does not believe that women should be allowed to have an abortion, and for that matter, he doesn't think they should be allowed to vote, he has also threatened to use his AK-47 against the government if they get too big for their britches. He also believes that Sandy Hook was a hoax, that 9/11 was an inside job, and that the music industry is run by Satan. North Carolina has tended to be a purple state, passing the office of the governor back and forth between the parties. If Robinson is elected, he will be the state's first black governor. However, this Holocaust denier is running against Democrat Josh Stein, who, if elected, will be the state's first Jewish governor. You would think that this wouldn't be a tough choice for North Carolina, but current polls indicate that these two candidates, a Jew and a Holocaust denier, are in a dead heat, which means that for nearly half the citizens of North Carolina, ideas such as anti-Semitism, misogyny, homophobia, even just raw, horrible disrespect for families with children who were slain in the nation's worst school shooting, this is all now a part of the acceptable status quo. And I submit that this is horrifying. Please, listeners in North Carolina, get me booked into your churches as a guest speaker before the November election. I would like to say in your pulpit what your permanent pastor may not want to say. These sick ideas did not become a part of mainstream language in North Carolina or in other conservative pockets in America overnight. They slip into office chatter, into conversations at church potlucks, and between pickleball matches at the senior center. And what is worse, most of Robinson's supporters are under 50. How have younger voters become so vulnerable to the most insane and idiotic of conspiracy theories? Somehow, this violent, prejudiced worldview crept into the language until it became sufficiently normative that now the next governor of North Carolina may be even a more dangerous sociopath than the GOP's nomination for president in this fall's election. And that, men and women, is saying a lot. You can't see it in the video, but the caption on this banner behind me, the banner we had made for our church when we started in 2008, is a quote from the Jewish Holocaust survivor, Elie Wiesel. It says, "Thou shalt not stand idly by." Wiesel said that the Holocaust would never have happened if only the people of that time had not stood back in horror, most of them, but they stood back and they allowed it to happen. Now in 2024, racism, anti-Semitism, anti-women's rights, anti-gay rights, anti-science thinking is threatening the Western world. It is threatening the existence of liberal democracy. It is threatening all of us with a world that I guarantee you don't want to live in. You cannot stand idly by in this time of crisis. Speak up, get involved, and please share this video with your crazy uncle who needs to know where you stand before those family cookouts start up this summer, because this is going to be a long, hot election year, and we cannot let these people define what is normal for all of us.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.